Hey, slightly different one. This it's nothing to do with news or anything in the news. It's more about guess life generations, and I don't know. I thought it would just be an interesting video. Very spontaneous, I should say. Recently, I've been in a 1980s mood, and this is very appropriate because I was born in the 80s. So I was watching lockdown's obviously easing now. My friend came around. We watched an 80s double bill last night, and no copyright infringement intended here. But we watched The Breakfast Club, followed by Ferris Bueller's Day Off, both John Hughes directed films, 1985 and 1986 respectively. I was also listening to a lot of 80s music just on YouTube. So I just want to talk a bit about the 80s. Um, I don't know, nothing specific, just thoughts about the 80s and about generations and so on. It's funny because when you look at comments on videos like that, it's very much like, wish I was a teenager in the 80s and stuff. I think every generation has good and bad. I mean, the 80s had plenty of problems, certainly in Britain and certainly in this region, Northeast England. I mean, the 80s was a tough, tough time with Thatcherite policies and so on. Yet, I think for many people, my age, there's a strange nostalgia for a decade that we didn't actually really directly experience. It's a strange thing. I mean, I shouldn't say always, but for a long time, I have connected with the 80s. I mean, for a long time, it was like, okay, it's just another decade. But then I sort of think, well, actually, that was the decade I was born in. And I was, right, 1st of September 1985. Um, The very same day, by the way, the Titanic was rediscovered. I was born in Belfast, so connection there. But um, right bang in the middle of the decade. I I very much connect with the 80s. I think it's significant. If you were born in the mid 80s, you by definition fall into the millennial category, but not category, that's the wrong term, the millennial generation, but you're an older millennial. So the definition of millennial is anyone born roughly between 1983 and 1998. But like I said, it's a loose definition that could be 1981 to 1999 or 1983 to 2000. But roughly that's, millennials. That is people who came of age around the turn of the century. Um, so in the year 2000, I was 14. Um, But the funny thing about this kind of connection with the 80s is I didn't grow up in the 80s. I grew up in the 2000s and the 2010s, still growing up, the 2020s. So I wonder 20 or 30 years from now, will people look at the 2010s in a nostalgic way like they look at I say 2010s because we're only like first year of the 2020s. It's too early to really define this decade apart from coronavirus. It's very difficult to establish it culturally. It isn't even easy to do culturally because so much music and films have been put on hiatus. It's even difficult to establish the 20s for popular culture so far. Um, but it's a curious thing. I mean, I wonder, would my parents' generation, for example, would my parents connect with the 50s because they were both born in the 50s? As far as I know, they don't. I mean, it's not like my parents listen to 50s music and stuff. They like it, but they don't particularly. Um, and I actually think there's a bit of psychology here. I think other generations connect to the time that they grew up. I think a lot of millennials or older millennials like myself connect with the 80s because it's almost the last period just before the rise of the internet in the mid 90s. And really, it didn't become very commercially viable until the early 2000s. But I think we almost look at the 80s as the last. era without all of that, and yet it's modern times. I mean, it's just a curious one because it is getting further back now. Beginning of the 1980s is 40 years ago. So all these films, The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Say Anything, Labyrinth, you name it, Karate Kid, Rocky Four, all those great 80s films, they're getting further back now, and yet they still somehow feel fresh. I heard someone describe, like culturally speaking, the 80s was all good times, parties, fun, and girls, and the 90s is all depression and darkness. I think that was like a reference to music. I wouldn't entirely agree with that. I think the 90s had plenty of fun as well, but I do understand where they're going with that. I mean, at the moment at least, I don't quite connect with the 2000s and the 2010s, even though I grew up in them. I'm talking about popular culture. Might just be personal taste, but for example, there's some music I like from the past 10 years, and there's some music I like from the 2000s, quite a bit, but it's maybe not so much of popular music. I tend to go for more independent type music. Certainly not stuff that would be well recognized. For example, if there was a compilation CD of 2010s music, I doubt that much of it would be in my preference. Um, I think the thing with generations is they shouldn't be rigidly bound. So it's not like we all owe loyalty to a particular generation. Like you were born in the mid 80s, so you owe loyalty to the 80s in terms of your interests or whatever. Or, for example, you came of age in the 2000s, the 2010s. I mean, there's certainly things that I will remember from those periods that I do associate as my generation because the 80s wasn't my generation. It's the time I was born, and yet it is and it isn't. What I'm driving at here is I think that people actually connect to two generations: the generation that they come of age and the generation that they are born in. Now, the interesting thing about the Breakfast Club and Ferris Bueller's Day Off and things like that, the cast are all now in their mid 50s, so they would by definition be baby boomers, or at least the older side of Generation X, because that the 80s was Generation X. That was their generation. What we have right now, people coming of age are either millennials or we're even now getting into Generation Alpha, or Generation Z. So I find this stuff very interesting. I mean, the millennials right now are the biggest generation. We've just surpassed baby boomers in terms of size. So we are an important generation in that sense in terms of social influence. Um, but I don't know. I just wonder, does anyone else feel this way? Anyone else born in the 80s, as Calvin Harris would say, acceptable in the 80s? I actually think maybe people born in the early 90s might feel something similar because people born in the early 90s, it's a similar sort of generation. I mean, it was a period before social media. So someone born I've got friends born in the early 90s. I had a girlfriend born in 1992. She was 7 years younger than me, but she was also born at a time before social media. I'm thinking of my little nieces and nephews. They're born, my niece is 8 years old, my nephews are a bit younger. So they were born at a period when they will never know a world without social media. Of course, their parents don't just let them use, they're too young to be using Facebook and stuff, but it's a strange thought. I mean, when I think of the 80s, um, of course, it wasn't all feel good. The 80s in Britain was a very tough time, a lot of disasters at that time. But it's strange. I don't know. I just have some sort of empathy with the 80s. And I think that there was a sort of, it is refreshing to see young people interacting, even if it's not entirely good, even if they're arguing, without smartphones getting in the way of everything. I'm a bit of a Luddite when it comes to smartphones because I do feel that they have many assets, but I think they're also a big distraction from basic social communication. And I think in some ways, social communication these days has whittled down. It's it's changed somehow, not entirely in a good way. Obviously, with lockdown, we're all in this situation, whatever generation we're in. But often in history, world-changing events, big, profound events, and coronavirus definitely is. It's up there as one of the most profound events in in history, really. Certainly, at least in modern history, in terms of its influence, I think, on the world, in terms of the sort of social effects it's having. I do think this is profound. So this may well be seen as a big sort of cut-off point of generations. Yeah, I don't know. Um, but I just want to know if anyone else, like that is people now in their 30s, i.e., born in the 80s, people in their, let's say, from maybe late 20s to late 30s. You were born in the 1980s or early 90s. How do you feel about this? Do you feel a kind of connection with that time period? Because I do. I feel like strange is almost nostalgia for something I didn't directly experience. I mean, I think every generation, in terms of, I mentioned music. When I was much younger, I was really into ABBA, which of course is 70s. Um, and I like music from every era. I can appreciate music from the 50s right up to the 2010s. Classical music as well, going beyond that. But it's just a curious thing. Maybe I'm just getting more reflective about my life. Therefore, I look at the 80s like that was my time. I don't know. That's the time I was born. I mean, I wonder, is there a precedent for this in history? I wonder, were people born in the 1880s who were coming of age in the First World War? Was there a thing there? I mean, the 19th century, unless I'm mistaken, was the first century in which decades started to be defined as decades. For example, we don't really think of, like, the historical texts don't look at the 1560s versus the 1590s, you know. But by the 19th century, if you look at, for example, particularly in American sources, they're talking about the 60s, they're talking about the 1860s, the 70s, they're starting to talk in those terms. So that's not an entirely 20th century phenomenon. I mean, certainly the whole thing about having themed parties and compilation CDs celebrate a particular decade, that's something that's been done in recent years, but the idea of actually distinguishing decades has been going on since the 19th century. I no doubt it will go on in this century. I mean, we're going to know this decade as the 2020s. Um, and that's interesting. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. Were you born in the mid 80s? Or even if you're a bit older, maybe you are Generation X. You were of this generation. Maybe you're in your mid 50s now. Um, do you connect with the 80s? Because one theory about Generation X is they feel less connected to their generation than other generations, i.e., baby boomers or millennials. So I don't know. Um, I'd be interested in hearing different perspectives, i.e., if you are someone who's like a teenager in the 80s, how do you feel about the 80s? Was it a great time? Was it not a great time? A lot of this, of course, depends where you live. I reckon if you were growing up in the north of England in the 80s, it wasn't all roses. Um, People have a strange nostalgia about periods of time, and it was never all good or all bad. I mean, we can't look back at the 2010s and say it was all rubbish or it was all good or whatever. Certainly, a lot of very important things that happened in my life happened in the 2010s. Yeah, I'm still not quite at a point where I think, yeah, that was my, I don't know, just thinking openly here. I think every decade has good and bad. And for me, probably it was the 80s and the 2010s. The 80s, the decade I was born, And the 2010s, a decade that was really some of the most important relationships and social interactions in my life. I mean, I actually went to high school or sixth form in the 2000s, yet in some ways I connect more with the 2010s. I was happier in the 2010s overall from the 2000s. My social life was better. My love life was better in the 2010s. So I think if I'm comparing the two decades side by side, for me personally, the 2000s and 2010s, 2010s is better. That's just personal. Okay, let me know your thoughts.